Chapter 1. It was the early hours of the morning. The night sky was without a single star to shine, and the wind was frighteningly bitter. A right-minded person would shelter from the frost and the unforgiving weather, and yet a young girl was walking. She couldn't shelter. Her skin was pale, her eyes closed. She'd shut them to rest a while ago, and now they refused to open. Her hands were stuffed in her pockets, her fingertips turned blue, and her blonde hair lashing against her numb skin. She took small, agonizing steps, her feet raw with blisters and bruises. Her dainty eyes opened for a brief moment, only for a moment, to see she was walking into an alleyway. In her mind, she would rest just for a moment. It wasn't safe to linger. Her senses had become dull. The terrain was getting the better of her. Her body cried for water, for warmth, for food. She had none to take. She had been running for days, putting her body through torture. Her head began to lower, and her knees buckled beneath her. She couldn't sleep. If she did, she may never wake up. But there was no strength left, though, as she slumped forward, and her body fell to the floor. The winter air continued to bellow as the darkness closed in on her conscience. She couldn't sleep. She could hear someone calling, but her mind could no longer translate. She must not sleep. Her eyes opened. Shadows moved. The cast of a silver gleam came briefly into view from the corner of her eye. She needed to move, but the cold pressed down on her. Exhaustion got the better of her. Her eyes closed, and sleep she did. She was disturbed by a nightmare, one she'd had on and off for the past few weeks. She wanted to wake up, to escape the terrors that would occur again. The atmosphere had a sinister feel to it, as though an ungodly action was taking place. A long and narrow corridor stretched for miles before her eyes. The walls seemingly encroached around her, but they were made of steel that was still. She had never been here in person before, she was sure of it. Or at least, she thought she was sure. But the vivid dream continued to haunt her, and each time more detail was added. A stench overwhelmed her, making her gag as it drifted into her nostrils. It was a strange smell, similar to meat. She began to cry silently, knowing what was going to happen. It was always the same. She desperately wanted to wake up now, and not face what was to occur. Ahead of her were the shadows of people. She could hear them whimpering and whining from afar. She started running towards them. Forever and ever her feet raced towards them. The figures sat up, some sobbing. They turned their backs to her. Their attention was set on a dangerous and demonic silhouette. Its outline was larger than any creature she had seen before. Her feet struck the ground in loud steps as she desperately tried to reach them. She knew what was going to happen, and frantically wanted it to stop. The sound of machinery racketed from elsewhere. She could hear gears turning from far away. The figures moved down the corridor and towards the fiend. All of them disappeared from view, except one person who remained, staring back at the girl as she tried desperately to reach them. The sound of screaming emitted from far away, the machinery louder. Losing her footing, she tripped over. Her head hit the cold floor with a dull thud. She lay on the ground, pain seething in her head. The sound of whirring blades and ripping echoed around the corridors as the walls seemed to get closer together. The flow of blood from somewhere far away could be heard. She lifted her head. Everyone was gone. Everyone was gone but that one girl only meters away. And as the dreamer watched, the walls behind that girl began to produce strange patterns. Patterns that became trails. Trails that traced their way toward the other girl, reaching for her like dark, red fingers. That girl was in danger. In terror, the dreamer pulled herself up from the floor and onto her knees. The other girl turned her back to her, staring at the dangerous being. She screamed out for her to run away from the monster, but no sound left her throat. The seeping fingers moved quicker. They peeled off from the walls, darting towards the other girl. The victim's eyes were closed tightly. Bloody fingers coiled around the body forcefully. The dreamer pulled herself from the floor and grabbed the girl's hand, trying to pull her free. The fiend emerged from the darkness. Its pair of large crimson eyes, the only visible portion of its being, was staring in their direction as the red ropes tightened and pulled harder. It began to lift the girl from her feet. The dreamer was crying out loudly, gripping the victim's hand as tightly as possible. She was struggling to hold on to the damsel, but her grasp was weakening. "Flee from him! Flee from the crimson!" the other girl pleaded with her, opening her eyes to look upon the girl, her face distorting into one the dreamer recognized. In shock, she let her go, and the child from the dream was launched down the corridor towards the monster. The girl had been watching herself being taken by the devil. It hadn't been a simple nightmare. The vision had tortured her for the last week, night after night of terror-stricken hauntings. The voices and sounds, the colours and images, the stench and the fear within the dream were now gone. The only thing that remained on her mind was the shattered sentence. The people that were in her dream didn't have faces before. For one of them, to cry out to her was perplexing. For one of them, to be her was terrifying. She stirred from her position after it had awoken her. Her head was too foggy for her to open her eyes. She shifted through the grey in her mind, trying to make sense. The relentless cold that seeped into her bones made it difficult to think rationally. She knew she had to keep moving, and falling had been a bad idea. But as she tried to move her numb body, she realized there was a pressure on her shoulders. "She's coming to," a stranger's voice came from behind her. It wasn't a voice she recognized. At least, she didn't think she recognized it. Her shoulders and arms were beginning to warm, and the rest of her body still felt unbelievably frozen. "Keep an eye on her then, won't you?" another voice spoke out. The sound of footsteps moved away from her. She realized the pressure she felt was a friction running up and down the length of her arms and shoulders, now ceased. "Wait, Vicky, don't just leave me with—" "I'm getting her some water. Don't let her freeze." She assumed the other voice was Ricky, as she heard footsteps walking away. The pressure on her shoulders came back. Slowly, her eyes opened. It was still extremely dark, but her eyes slowly began to adjust to the faint light coming from the main street. She noticed a jacket was around her shoulders, and the movement of a hand going up and down, trying to bring feeling back into her body. She glanced over her shoulder to meet a young man. His hand stopped moving. His eyes widened as he looked at her. "Thank you," she whispered to him. As she spoke, her throat felt dry and rough. A shy smile crept onto his face. "Don't worry about it," he spoke quietly, his eyes resting against the jacket. "Do you want anything to drink?" A tangle of dark brunette hair mopped over his face. His cheeks were dirty as though he hadn't washed in a good while. "Please," she heard her own voice come out. She felt fingers grasp her arms as her body was pulled up into a standing position. Every part of her body protested against being moved, but she couldn't stop it from happening. She slumped backwards, her back resting against a brick wall, her legs trembling as she tried to steady herself. It wasn't the boy that had lifted her, but a man with a crooked smile. "What drugs are you on, kid?" He spoke coldly to her. His clothes didn't fit properly, showing off sturdy muscles and tough skin, visible even in the dark. "Ricky, don't," the boy protested, but was cut short by a quick glare from his friend. "You don't know anything about her, Mike," Ricky scolded him angrily. Ricky turned back to face her, his head pressed close to hers, and their foreheads almost touching. He pulled a torch from his back pocket and held it up. A light shone brightly into her eyes as she closed them sharply. Ricky placed his fingers over her eyelids and pried them open. The bright light highlighted deep bags under her green eyes. A single black pupil shrunk as the light touched her eye.
Well, your eyes aren't bloodshot,
Ricky commented as he turned the flashlight off.
So who are you? Why are you collapsed in the street?
Dawn Pearson, she managed to speak up a little more. I was travelling and... It was hurting her to talk. Mike pressed towards her as she felt the end of a bottle touching her lips. Without hesitation, she took his hand into her own and forced the tip of the bottle neck to push against her lip, water rushing into her dry mouth and down her throat. The water had never tasted as wonderful to her as she drank it as quickly as she could, scared as if it would be taken from her in an instant.
You're too bloody kind, Mike. You know that, right?
Ricky said as he stepped back. Thank you for the water, Dawn gasped in relief as she finally let go of Mike's hand, bowing her head slightly in courtesy. She rested her hand against the wall and looked towards the opening of the alleyway. She vaguely remembered walking into this alleyway. It had been unwise to stop travelling. She had to keep moving. I have to go, she rumbled, prying herself away from the wall. Before the two could respond, she removed the jacket from her shoulders, placed it in Mike's hands, and then steadily walked out of the alleyway. As she stepped onto the path, she gazed up at the streetlight that illuminated the roads. It was still deathly cold. The alleyway no longer shielded her from the winter's cruel wind. She placed her hand against the streetlight, taking in a deep breath, and the cold air rushing into her lungs and biting at her insides. Footsteps approached from behind. It's dangerous for you to be out here on your own, Mike called out, walking to her side. Where are you from? Your parents must be worried sick. For a while she stood still. Her mind was having a tantrum, demanding she ate and drank and slept until she was satisfied. She couldn't think straight. Her mind kept jumping to the demand that she keep moving. It was the only true thought she had.
If she wants to go, let her go,
Ricky told his friend as he tried to pull Mike away. Dawn's legs were shaking as she attempted to walk. Her mind was unclear, and she felt a pang from hunger. There was only one thing on her mind. She had to move. She couldn't stop. She must keep moving. You're trembling. Please let us help, Mike insisted, resting his jacket over her again. She stared at him, her mind still numb. She was in conflict. She needed to leave. She needed help. She hadn't eaten, or drank, or slept properly in days.
We'll sort you out, kid.
Ricky let out a strained sigh, pushed into helping her from the insistence of his friend. I need to get going, Dawn protested. Ricky approached her from the front. He bent his knee slightly, so their eyes met at equal height.
You need energy then. We're squatting at the moment. There's food and shelter there. Get your energy back, else Mike's going to worry himself sick about you. I know they say not to trust strangers, and I know Ricky is a bit rough-looking, but it's only to keep ourselves safe, Mike added. I know neither of you are going to hurt me, Dawn muttered under her breath. I don't want to be a burden, but I could really do with some food and warmth. With that, Ricky placed his arm under hers and helped her stand upright. The awkward trio walked along the pathway, making their journey through the night. So where do you live? She asked them politely, but neither replied, simply coaxing her to follow. They bypassed through side paths, beside shops and through residential blocks. As they continued to travel, she noticed how the houses became less and less welcoming. Her head throbbed as she walked towards an industrial site. Large warehouses towered over them, their lights long since been turned off for the night. You doing okay? Mike asked her. It's not much further now. She nodded, but she was nervous. They diverted between tool factories. Dawn placed her free hand to her head. Mike noticed and placed his hand over her shoulder. Her mind was throbbing more and more with every step. It was happening again. This feeling was not uncommon to her, and it was starting up once more. As they took a few more steps, a strong sense kicked in. Her eyes widened as she heard distorted cries within her mind. She heard the sounds of machinery stirring. She took in sharp breaths as she began to feel hotter, so much hotter, far too hot to be a part of the real world. Her fingers trailed over her arms, finding goosebumps all over. They felt icy to the touch, yet the heat continued from within her head.
Echoes of her nightmare were creeping into her mind. It was then the girl from the nightmare screamed through Dawn's soul in desperation. "Don't go that way!" Dawn exclaimed sharply. In a panic, she pulled away from Ricky's aid, stumbling slightly backwards. The two boys stopped in their tracks and turned to face her. It was the first time she had spoken above a whisper, let alone a normal tone. Mike raised his eyebrow. Uncertainty showed within his expression.
"Look, Princess, I'm frozen and I don't want to linger outside,"
Ricky told her firmly. "You don't understand," she begged. "I can sense... We can't go down there." Ricky shook his head in disgust, shoving his hands into pockets. In pure arrogance, he stormed down the path. The walls were closed in tightly. Bins were dotted around the place in a chaotic fashion, forcing him to twist and turn as he made his way through. At the other end was a slit of dim light coming from a street light. "They didn't believe me either, now they... I tried to warn them." Dawn trailed off, her eyes watering.
"Warn who?"
Mike asked her.
"Nut job,"
Ricky called out unpleasantly, nearing the end of the stretch.
"Come on, Dawn. I don't think you'd be able to make the detour. This way is much quicker."
Mike tried to persuade her as he followed his friend. Dawn stood still. He turned and made his way through the industrial site, the narrow pathway between two factories. He figured she would follow when she realized she wouldn't want to be on her own.
"Is she coming or what?"
Ricky called out as he was halfway through. A flash of steel caught Dawn and Mike's sight. The smash of a crowbar echoed across the passage. Ricky smashed against a huddle of bins, sending some of the trash flying out the alleyway. The metallic sound rang out and bounced across the walls. Mike took in a sharp breath, and for that split second he noticed the three men that were coming towards him. He gulped, gazing back along the dark walls he had passed, looking in Dawn's direction. Had she known? "I've got nothing on me," Mike cried out in defence, trying to back away from them. He felt his back touch the wall as one of them laughed, taking out a knife. Mike was outnumbered. Two of the men grabbed his arms and held him against the wall. He felt the knife touching his neck. There was nowhere to run to. The one with the crowbar flashed his rotten teeth as he raised his weapon high. His black grin grew as a stench filtered out from between them. Mike closed his eyes tightly, ready to embrace the blunt instrument. Dawn watched the spectacle from the other side. Her body felt like it was on fire as the distorted cries continued loudly. Her eyes glanced down at her feet as the lid of a bin rolled from the alleyway and toppled next to her. Taking in shaky breaths, she stared down the dark alleyway. The three men were going to kill Mike. These people were strangers to her. It would have been easy to leave them and find her own safety. "Get away from him, you thugs!" A loud call came from out the alleyway. Mike glanced over in fright, spotting Dawn standing at the entrance. The wind blew harshly against her, making her body shiver slightly. Her hair whisked harshly to one side. He trembled, begging in his head that she ran away. She was going to be beaten to death.
"Thugs?"
one of the attackers snarled, lifting up the crowbar and walking towards Dawn. The other men kept Mike pinned to the wall. In the distance, Ricky was trying to pull himself back to his feet. If the knife wasn't touching Mike's Adam's apple, he'd have yelled out at her to run. He was too terrified to swallow, though. He could only watch as the muscular fiend approached her. "If you know what is good for you, you should leave," she spoke. "Now." The large fellow laughed hard, swinging the crowbar effortlessly in the air. The heat doubled. It felt like her insides were being burnt alive. She had to touch her arm again to make sure. Her fingertips brushed the goosebumps from the cold once more. Mike held back the tears as best he could. He prayed that Dawn fled. He defiantly told her.
"Oh, you little bitch. You're going to pay for..."
She interrupted him, a wave of courage pouring into her. "Pay for what? You're all low-life scum." His face screwed up in rage. He roared out as he charged towards her, the crowbar held high. She simply stood there, as he was feet away. Rage blinded people. Her eyes widened as the world around her changed. Everything went in slow motion. As the crowbar made its descent, she simply kept her ground. It crashed downwards, a few centimetres away from her foot. His warning shot had seemingly been unacknowledged. His head turned as the girl smiled at him. Before he realized what was happening, her foot rose quickly and struck his groin. He screamed as he fell to his knees, sobbing like a child on the floor. She wasn't strong, but in that moment she knew exactly where to strike. As the other two men spotted the spectacle, they immediately darted towards her, letting Mike go. He stood there, trembling and gobsmacked. He couldn't bring himself to move, frozen in shock. Her eyes studied both of them. His mind was yelling at himself to flee, leave her and save himself. Dawn's senses had spiked in her mind. It was overwhelming, knowing that if she timed it wrong, she would be in more trouble than Mike was in. Her eyes were set on the man with the knife. He was the greatest danger. She picked up the bin lid that was on the floor, running her fingers over the rim. Her eyes locked onto a target as she held the lid to her chest, her arm coiled around it. Her arms trembled, still fatigued from before. She didn't need to rely on strength, only accuracy and timing. He was only a few meters away as she turned her body slightly. The heat was building up, intense like she'd thrown herself into the heart of the sun. The sounds were now shrill and high. She was waiting for the screaming in her head to reach its peak. She licked her lips once. She was cutting it very short. Then she knew the moment had come as her mind pounded against her skull and a sheer screech drilled into her subconscious. She threw the lid towards him as hard as she could. She felt strength in her arm that she knew she didn't have before. The lid struck him in the head, the metal clanging as it made contact. He toppled backwards and collapsed on the floor. The third man instantly stopped his pursuit, taking a few steps back. "Step aside," she told, rather than asked. He nodded, taking a step to one side, his eyes fixated on the others, who continued to whimper on the floor. As she passed them, she sped towards Mike. "Are you okay?" she asked him. "Where's your friend?" He shook himself from his frozen state as he ran to the other side and knelt next to his friend. He was nursing his right hand, cursing under his breath as he slowly stood up. As Dawn approached them, Ricky lunged for her, grabbing her by the scruff of her collar and thrusting her against the wall with his left hand. She was pinned up against a factory wall, her feet no longer touching the ground. She did not squirm or struggle.
"Did you set them up?"
Ricky spat at her. "She saved us," Mike exclaimed, trying to pull his friend from her. "I promise you, I didn't." Dawn expressed concern as she looked up at him.
"Are you fucking with me?"
Ricky snarled at her, flipping a switchblade from his pocket, and held it in front of her, allowing the dim light to catch the metal surface. "I know you won't hurt me," she replied. As she spoke, she raised her hand, touching her palm to the sharp blade. The two stared at each other for some time. Dawn seemed fairly relaxed, while Ricky glared. Mike eventually intervened, pushing his friend away from Dawn. She was dropped to the floor, looking up at the two. "I can sense danger," she explained. "I can sense it right down to the seconds. I was traveling because something big was coming. I had to leave my home. I tried to warn them, and they didn't believe me like I tried to warn you." Mike stared at her, gobsmacked that a girl who barely looked to be a teenager was coming out with this. She could sense danger? Was that even possible?
"Who the hell are you, and where the fuck did you come from?"
Ricky bellowed.